Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into Red Sea disruption, from Suez to today. If a single line on a map can move prices across continents, delay factory shifts, and rewrite a nation's budget, do you want to see how it works? In this episode you will get three things. First, a clear mental model for why narrow waterways like the Suez Canal and the Red Sea hold so much power over everyday life. Second, the incentive math that turns a security headline into a very real cost on a ship owner's spreadsheet. Third, a grounded look at how markets adapt, sometimes in ways that create new risks we do not notice until they bite. By the end, you will see how distance, time, and risk stack together to shape global outcomes. Let us begin with the geography. The Suez Canal and the Red Sea are not just places. They are a system that concentrates movement between Europe and Asia into a narrow corridor. Think of it like the neck of an hourglass. Billions of tons of goods want to pass through a space only so wide and governed by rules only so flexible. Because so much traffic is squeezed into that neck, small changes in conditions create large consequences. If water level, weather, or regulations shift a little, the flow of sand through the neck changes a lot. In trade, that shows up as waiting times, rerouting, and cost spikes that ripple outward. Distance is not just a line on a globe. Distance has a price. Every extra nautical mile means more fuel, more crew time, more wear on engines, and more opportunity cost for a vessel that could have been carrying the next cargo sooner. Economists sometimes call this the distance elasticity of trade. When you shorten the route between buyers and sellers, trade grows. When you lengthen it, trade shrinks or slows. The effect is not linear. A relatively small percentage change in distance can create a much larger percentage change in trade volume and schedule reliability. That is why shaving a few days matters and why adding a week or two matters even more. Now layer policy and engineering on top of geography. A canal is not only a channel. It is a bundle of rules and prices. There are tolls for passage. There are piloted requirements. There are slot allocations and draft limits. There are seasonal constraints and security protocols. Each of those converts into time and money. Ships do not just ask what is the shortest path. They ask what is the cheapest and most reliable path once you include tolls, queue risk, speed limits, and insurance. That combination is the effective price of passage. Insurance belongs right next to tolls and time. If underwriters judge a route riskier this week than last week, they can raise the premium for that specific voyage or limit coverage altogether. That single line item can swing the decision to use Suez or to go around Africa. When the risk premium rises, the effective price of the choke point rises with it. Owners and charterers respond by re-optimizing. Some slow down to save fuel. Some speed up to keep delivery promises. Some reroute around the Cape of Good Hope. The key idea is simple. No decree or press release automatically makes ships feel safe. What changes behavior is the number a captain and an owner see when they total up fuel, time, tolls, and risk. You might ask, why do narrow places like this matter even more now than in the past? Because we have built a system that relies on speed, precision, and scale. Megaships reduce cost per container when the route is smooth. Just-in-time logistics reduce warehouse costs when the sea lane is predictable. Thin inventories assume tomorrow looks like today. Choke points are fine when everything works. When something shifts, the system has very little slack. That means the price of a small disruption can feel large, and the incentive to avoid that disruption grows quickly. There is a moral dimension beneath the math. A canal fee is public revenue for a state. A detour is a private cost for a firm. An accident or attack is a risk that can spill costs onto third parties who did not choose the route at all. The system works best when the people who decide the route face the real costs of that choice and can freely adapt. When prices reflect reality, ships move along the paths that make the most sense. When prices are distorted or hidden, risk can build quietly until it appears as a shock. So here is the simple playbook for this entire story. Geography sets the stage. Policy and engineering write the rules of the game. Insurance and freight markets keep score in real time. Captains and owners respond to those signals with the tools they control. Speed, route, inventory, and the rest of the world reads the scoreboard with a lag through delivery times, product prices, and budget lines. Keep that flow in your head as we move forward. Risk becomes price. Price becomes behavior. Behavior becomes macro outcomes you and I can see. Ready to move deeper. On the next slide we will test this framework against history and watch what happened when access to Suez changed for years, not days. Let us rewind to two moments when the hourglass neck narrowed so much that global trade had to relearn how to flow. First, the Suez Crisis in 1956. Second, the long closure from 1967 to 1975. These are not trivia night dates. They are natural experiments that reveal how distance, policy access, and incentives translate into trade and income. Start with 1956. A sudden geopolitical shock changes who can use the canal and on what terms. Overnight, the calculus for shipowners shifts. The shortest route between Europe and Asia becomes uncertain, then costly, then sometimes unusable. What do firms do when the rules of the game change? They do not wait for speeches. They do math. How many days does the Cape of Good Hope add? How much extra fuel? What does that do to crew time, charter rates, and delivery promises? Insurance underwriters follow the same logic. Higher perceived risk means higher premiums or tighter coverage. In other words, the headline becomes a number on an invoice, and the number pushes ships one way or another. Now, the longer closure from 1967 to 1975 turns the short-run scramble into a long-run adaptation. This is where we see something essential. Distance is more than miles. It is a tax on exchange. Economists measuring these episodes found a simple but powerful pattern. When you increase distance by a given percent, trade falls by a larger percent, and the effect compounds over time. Countries and firms do not simply eat the cost for 8 years. They redesign. New supply routes develop. Different ports rise. Inventory strategies change. Insurance contracts get rewritten. What starts as a D-tier becomes the new normal. There is a second-order effect here that people often miss. When the world reoptimizes around a longer route, prices do not just go up once. They ripple. Freight rates adjust. Delivery times stretch. Inventories have to be bigger to maintain the same level of reliability. Working capital is tied up longer. And that has income consequences. If moving the same goods now requires more time, more fuel, and more money, then less is left over for everything else. The closure years show how a persistent barrier to a choke point can act like a slow leak in prosperity. Notice who makes the pivotal decisions in these episodes. Governments control access to the canal and set the official terms. But shipowners, underwriters, and shippers decide how to respond. The policy switch flips the incentive structure, and the market rearranges itself accordingly. In 1967 to 1975, this rearrangement lasted long enough to harden into habit. New patterns became embedded in schedules, contracts, and even ship design choices. When the canal reopened, not every pattern snapped back. Some adaptations stuck because they had uncovered practical advantages elsewhere. So the lesson from the historical playbook is not mysterious. Deny or degrade access to the shortest path and you do not just inconvenience a few voyages. You change the effective price of distance for a big share of world trade. Change that price long enough and you shift trade volumes and, ultimately, incomes. Insurance markets, freight markets, and inventory policies are the gears that transmit the shock from the policy decision to the real economy. Once you see those gears, the rest of this story becomes much easier to understand. On our next slide, we will jump to a modern, unforgettable picture that compresses all of this into one scene and one giant ship. Picture a single ship turned at the wrong angle, and an artery of world trade suddenly feels like a clenched fist. The image is seared into our minds. A vast container vessel wedged across the Suez Canal, bow and stern pressed into sand, tugs straining like ants against a fallen tree. For 6 days, that one error multiplied across thousands of schedules. Not because the world forgot how to sail, but because our system leaves almost no slack for mistakes. Let us unpack what that image quietly tells us. First, scale. Megaships are incredible machines. They lower cost per box when everything is smooth. But like any optimization, they narrow the margin for error. A vessel that fills the channel leaves less room to maneuver in wind, current, or human misjudgment. The economics of scale draw us toward bigger hulls, higher stacks, tighter timetables. The physics of tight spaces do not care about our spreadsheets. Second, the queue. Off to either side of that stuck ship, the satellite view becomes a dotted line of waiting lights. Each dot is a plan unspooling, crews idling, perishable goods aging, chartered time burning. And far from the canal, factories start to miss parts, retail inventories wobble, and delivery promises grow vague. The queue is the visual form of opportunity cost. Every hour a ship waits is an hour it is not moving the next load. Multiply that by hundreds, and you get a backlog that keeps echoing even after the channel reopens. Third, just-in-time logistics. For decades, we designed supply chains to arrive exactly when needed, not a day earlier. That saves warehouse costs and looks beautiful on a balance sheet. But just-in-time is a contract with the world that says, please do not hiccup. The Ever Given was a hiccup with a megaphone. When a choke point stops, just-in-time turns into wait in line, and the cost of thin inventories reveals itself as production stoppages and rush shipments later on. Fourth, tail risk. The rare, high-impact event. On paper, a grounding like this is improbable. In real life, improbable events matter because their consequences are not linear. The cost of a 1% delay does not look like 1% of normal. It looks like piles of small costs that combine into large ones. Tugboats, dredgers, demurrage, insurance claims, contract disputes, missed windows at the next port, reshuffling that takes weeks to untangle. Tail risk is when a smooth system shows you where it is brittle. So what do we learn from that single, unforgettable frame? Not a moral about heroes or villains, but a systems lesson. When you optimize for speed and scale, you also concentrate vulnerability. When you pack schedules tight, you make small navigational errors matter a lot. When you rely on a narrow channel, you turn a local problem into a global one. None of this means we should fear efficiency. It means the price of efficiency includes the duty to respect the geometry of choke points and the reality of randomness. Hold that thought, because understanding fragility in one image will help us read the next chapter, where ships did not just wait, they chose to go a different way. Now we shift from accident to intent. Beginning in late 2023, a series of attacks in and around the Red Sea transformed a vital corridor into a rolling risk calculation. This is not a one-day closure like a grounding. It is a drumbeat. An attack here, a threat there, a near miss that becomes a memo, then an insurance clause, then a new route plan. The result is visible in one blunt metric. Suez transits fell sharply in early 2024, with year-over-year declines that told every shipowner the same story. The shortest path no longer felt like the safest path. What happens inside a shipping company when that story hardens? First, the operations team asks a simple question with complicated consequences. Do we accept higher risk to save time, or do we buy certainty with miles? The Cape of Good Hope becomes the pressure relief valve. The detour adds roughly 2 weeks for an Asia to Europe round, depending on speed and weather. 2 weeks is not just 2 squares on a calendar. It is more fuel burn. It is more crew days. It is a later arrival that can miss a preferred port window and ripple into the next voyage. Multiply that by a fleet and the schedule reshapes itself. Insurance translates fear into price. War risk premiums move from footnote to headline on the voyage cost sheet. An underwriter who yesterday offered standard cover may today cap exposure or quote a higher % of hull value for transiting the danger zone. Some owners will still go, perhaps with escorts, perhaps with additional precautions. Others will say no thanks, and swing south. In either case, the balance between time and risk is no longer theoretical. It is a number that changes behavior. Governments responded. Naval coalitions organized escorts and patrols. There were strikes, warnings, and sanctions designed to alter the attackers' incentives and reassure commercial traffic. Those measures matter. They can reduce the frequency of incidents and raise the cost of further aggression. But on the bridge of a ship, and in an insurer's office, the question remains narrower. What is the probability that my vessel is targeted on this particular transit, and if something happens, what are the consequences for the crew, the cargo, and the company? Until that perceived probability falls materially, the premium and the routing decisions will reflect caution. Notice how uncertainty itself becomes a cost. If an owner cannot predict whether next month's risk will look better or worse, it is safer to lock in the long way around and plan schedules accordingly. That decision cascades. Carriers update sailing times. Shippers revise delivery expectations. Importers adjust inventories. A tiny band on the map now pulls on threads across continents. None of this is a dramatic closure. It is a persistent elevation of risk that sets a new baseline for price and time. There is a human layer here that does not show up in a spreadsheet. Masters and crews weigh their own safety against contractual obligations and corporate plans. Port agents field calls about convoy timings and restricted areas. Families at home follow news they never used to track. The system may be global, but the choice to turn left at the Gulf of Aden or right toward the Cape is made by specific people after a series of very grounded conversations. So the picture for 2023 through 2025 is this. Attacks raise perceived risk. Insurers and owners reprice and reroute. The canal's usage dips. Longer voyages become the new normal for many lanes. And the costs do not end at the waterline. They pass through to factories, stores, And eventually to you and me, sometimes in price, sometimes in delays, often in both. Keep that chain in mind as we move forward, because next we will put numbers on how that risk gets priced into the voyage itself. Let us open the black box that turns a headline into a routing decision. Shipowners and charterers do not move on vibes. They move on a stack of costs that add up to what really matters, the effective price of a voyage. On this slide, we break that stack into its main layers and watch how a small change in perceived danger can tilt the whole calculation. Start with the familiar layers. Fuel, often called bunkers, is the biggest day-to-day variable. More miles mean more fuel burned, and speed compounds the effect. Crew time and maintenance scale with distance and days at sea. Port charges and canal tolls are relatively predictable, and so is the time charter or the opportunity cost of having a vessel committed to one run instead of another. In a steady world, you can estimate these with confidence and squeeze costs with slow steaming, careful scheduling, and a well-planned port rotation. Now add the layer that turns news into numbers, war risk insurance. Underwriters quote an additional premium when a ship enters a defined high-risk zone. It is often priced as a percentage of the vessel's insured value for that specific transit window. That sounds abstract until you do the math. Even a fraction of a percent applied to a modern hull is not pocket change. If the premium moves up, the cost of taking the shortcut can rival or exceed the cost of sailing the long way around. And if underwriters restrict coverage or raise deductibles, the comparison tilts further. Insurance capacity is not infinite. When incidents rise, some insurers step back, and the price of remaining capacity goes up. There is also the certainty premium that does not have its own line on the invoice. If a company fears coverage might be revoked mid-route or that exit permits and escorts are unreliable, planners will assign an internal cost to that uncertainty. It shows up as extra buffer days, contingency fuel, and an appetite for the longer but more predictable route. In practice, that internal cost becomes very real, because missing a berth window or a discharge slot can cascade into demurrage fees and schedule chaos on the next voyage. Rerouting is not just about spending more. It is about reliability. Think of the cost stack like a tower. Tolls and fuel are bricks you can count. War risk and uncertainty are wedges you stuff under the tower to keep it from wobbling. When the wedges get thicker, the tower stands straighter, but you pay in height. Companies pay more to reduce variance because customers and ports punish surprises. A slightly higher average cost can be cheaper than rolling the dice on a disruption that blows up a contract. Here is how the decision actually gets made in a planning room. One team plugs in the Suez route with current war risk quotes, escort assumptions, and expected delay times. Another team plugs in the Cape route with extra miles, fuel, and weather uncertainty. They compare not just expected costs, but the downside tails. What happens if an incident shuts the lane for a day? What happens if the convoy is delayed? What happens if the ship has to divert at the last minute and burns fuel at higher speed to catch a delivery window? If the downside tail on the short route looks nasty, the long route wins even when the averages are close. All of this flows back into freight markets. If many carriers choose the Cape, available capacity on Asia to Europe lanes tightens. Spot rates push up. Long-term contracts get repriced with risk clauses that did not exist before. Shippers see terms that include surcharges or longer delivery windows. Inventories get nudged higher to cushion the added transit time. A single premium on a voyage morphs into a series of small adjustments across the supply chain. So, how does risk get priced? Not by speeches, and not by wishful thinking. It gets priced by underwriters marking a zone as dangerous, by owners measuring exposure, by charterers valuing reliability, and by all of them adding up fuel, time, tolls, and the probability distribution of bad days. When the sum on the risky shortcut exceeds the sum on the safer detour, the wake points south toward the Cape. On the next slide, we will see what this means for fuel demand, for the kinds of ships that now carry a larger share of sensitive cargoes, and for the environmental and safety risks that do not always show up on the freight invoice. When ships detour, the ocean gets bigger. Not geographically, of course, but economically. Every extra mile becomes a little factory of fuel burn, crew time, and engine wear. Let us translate that into plain language. Rerouting around Africa instead of shooting through Suez multiplies ton miles, and ton miles are what drive bunker demand. More distance means more fuel. More fuel means higher operating cost. And the knock-on effects spread far beyond the engine room. Start with the captain's first lever, speed. There are two basic responses when a route gets longer. You can slow steam to save fuel, accepting later arrivals. Or you can speed up to keep schedules, which burns fuel at a disproportionate rate because resistance rises fast as speed climbs. Think of it like driving a car uphill. Going a little faster does not cost a little more. It costs a lot more. Companies juggle that trade-off voyage by voyage, cargo by cargo. Perishables, contracts with tight penalties, or high-value goods might justify higher speed. Other cargoes will accept a slower, cheaper ride. Aggregate all those choices across hundreds of ships, and you get a visible lift in total bunker consumption even if average speeds drop slightly. Why? Because the route itself got longer for a big slice of global traffic. Now to the fleets themselves. When sanctions and insurance restrictions reshape who can carry certain barrels of crude or refined products, a parallel market emerges. People call it the shadow fleet. These are often older tankers under opaque ownership and flags that do not ask many questions. Their economics look different. Lower acquisition costs, limited access to mainstream insurance, and routes designed to avoid scrutiny mean they can profit where regulated carriers cannot. But incentives matter. If an operator is squeezed on coverage and oversight, where will they economize? Maintenance, training, and safety margins are always tempted to give. That is not an accusation about every ship in that universe. It is simply the gravity of the incentives. Externalities are the costs that do not show up on the freight invoice but still show up in the world. Longer routes mean more emissions for the same delivered goods. Older tonnage with thinner oversight can raise the probability of spills, groundings, or onboard incidents. Slow steaming reduces fuel burn per day, but if the voyage is now many days longer, the total emissions may still be higher. Port cities feel the difference when schedules slip and idling ships crowd anchorages. Coastal ecosystems feel the difference if heightened traffic increases the odds of accidents. None of those effects were voted on by the people who breathe the air or fish the water. That is the definition of an externality. There is also a more subtle externality, reliability risk pushed onto everyone downstream. When voyages stretch and schedules wobble, shippers and retailers add buffer inventory to protect themselves. That ties up working capital. Warehouses fill. Missed handoffs create rush shipments by air, which are noisy, expensive, and carbon-intensive. So a threat in the Red Sea can become an overheated cargo hold on a last-minute flight thousands of miles away. The system is connected in ways that are easy to forget when everything is on time. Let us zoom in on incentives again, because they explain behavior better than speeches. If a canal transit carries a war risk premium and strict documentation, while a detour with a lightly regulated vessel carries fewer questions, certain cargoes will chase that path. That does not make the operators villains, and it does not make regulators saints. It simply reveals how rules and prices channel behavior. If we want safer outcomes, the durable solution is not to shout at shipowners. It is to align the cost structure so that safer choices are the cheaper choices over the life of the vessel. One last point for this slide. Externalities do not mean markets have failed. They mean the price is incomplete. When the risk of pollution, collision, or delayed medical evacuation for crews is mispriced, the ledger looks cheaper than the world really is. Complete that price with transparent liability, enforceable standards, and insurance that reflects true exposure, and you will watch behavior change without a single grand proclamation. Ships will choose routes and speeds that make sense not only for the balance sheet, but for the sea they sail. Hold that frame in your mind: longer routes, different fleets, and costs that spill past the hull. Next, we will ask the question everyone cares about in plain terms. Who gains? Who loses? And how does that balance shift as the situation evolves? When routes bend, ledgers move. The same disruption that punishes one balance sheet can quietly fatten another. On this slide, we are not assigning heroes and villains. We are following where the margins go when distance, time, and risk all rise together. Begin with canal states. For a country that depends on transit fees, every ship that detours is not just a boat that sailed elsewhere. It is foregone public revenue. Those fees fund salaries, maintenance, dredging, even social programs. When traffic dips, the math tightens. A shortfall today can become deferred maintenance tomorrow, and deferred maintenance has a habit of reappearing later as operational friction. That is a compounding loss you cannot always see on a single month report. Now step aboard the carriers, the companies that own or charter the ships. In the short run, detours can lift freight rates. Capacity gets tied up on longer voyages, which means fewer available sailings for the same set of customers. Scarcity bids up price. If you are a carrier with the right mix of ships and contracts, that can look like a win. But the win is not free. Extra fuel burn, longer cycle times, and higher insurance costs eat into those gains. And schedule reliability becomes a reputational risk. If your on-time performance slips, a temporary margin boost can be offset by tougher negotiations when customers renew their contracts. Shippers sit in the middle with a calculator in one hand and a promise in the other. They face surcharges, longer delivery windows, and the pressure to carry more inventory. For some products, especially high-value goods, shippers may swallow higher sea freight or even switch a portion to air to hit critical deadlines. That keeps shelves stocked but at a cost that someone must absorb. Either the shipper accepts lower margins, or the customer pays more, or both share the pain. For low-margin goods, there is less room to maneuver, so stocking decisions get sharper and product lines can quietly shrink. Consumers see the effects on a delay. Most prices do not jump the day a route changes. They drift. A seasonal item misses the season and gets discounted later. A specialty part arrives late and idles a repair shop. A retailer hides the cost in smaller sizes, fewer colors, or a promotion that quietly vanishes. Disruption rarely arrives at the cash register with a trumpet. It arrives as 100 small frictions. And what about energy markets? Longer routes and shifting flows can nudge refinery margins. When regional balances flip, say, more product ships the long way, local scarcity can widen differentials and help certain refiners for a time. But margins are fickle. They respond to inventory levels, maintenance cycles, and demand that does not always cooperate with shipping schedules. The temporary winners tend to be those positioned in the right place at the right moment, not necessarily the most efficient over the long run. There is also a winner that no one cheers for: volatility. When schedules lengthen and reliability falls, the value of flexibility rises. Firms that can reroute quickly, switch ports, or juggle modes of transport gain leverage. They look smart because they invested in options before they needed them. Meanwhile, firms locked into brittle contracts watch those same options priced out of reach. Volatility does not create value by itself, but it transfers bargaining power to those who can adapt fastest. Notice the pattern. Centralized revenues feel the pinch when canal usage drops. Private carriers may enjoy higher rates but face higher operating risk. Shippers juggle inventory and mode choices while protecting relationships with their customers. Consumers absorb the leftovers in subtle ways. The distribution is uneven in time as well as across players. A good month for carriers can be followed by a rough quarter when costs catch up or demand cools. A bad season for canal income can be followed by a recovery if confidence returns and routes snap back. The moral to carry forward is not that disruption helps or hurts a single group forever. It is that incentives reassign who bears which costs at each stage. When rules and risk change, the system does not freeze. It reprices. Those who can read that repricing early and adjust their behavior, whether a port authority adjusting fees, a carrier revising schedules, or a shipper rebalancing inventory, tend to come out less bruised than those who fight the new math. Keep that distributional lens in your pocket. On the next slide, we will compare two styles of response to this kind of shock: top-down fixes versus bottom-up adaptation powered by prices and contracts. When a sea lane turns risky, two instincts wake up at once. The first is centralized action. Convene coalitions. Announce patrols. Issue sanctions and warnings. The second is decentralized adaptation. Raise or remove ships from the lane. Reprice insurance. Rewrite contracts. Change ports. Which one works better? The honest answer is that both act on the same problem through different channels of time and incentives. Start with the centralized playbook. Navies assemble task forces and publish escort regimes. Intelligence services share threat pictures. Diplomats try to raise the cost of further attacks and lower the perceived risk of transit. This can reduce incident frequency and reassure some operators. But there is a friction that speeches cannot dissolve. An owner's decision is anchored to expected loss on a specific voyage. If the probability of a bad event, multiplied by the severity of that event, still exceeds their comfort, the presence of a task force is a helpful signal, not a guarantee. The ship will still ask, what is my risk, what is my coverage, and what happens to my schedule if the convoy slips by a day? Now the decentralized side. Markets turn fear into prices with astonishing speed. Underwriters adjust war risk quotes by zone and week. Charterers update clauses and delivery windows. Ports alter fees to attract ships that now need different rotation patterns. Bunker suppliers reposition inventory along the new long route. No one has to command this. It happens because each party bears their own slice of the cost of being wrong. When the price of passage through a choke point rises, captains do not hold a vote. They alter course. Where do these approaches clash, and where do they reinforce each other? They clash when centralized proclamations try to substitute for accurate pricing. If a government signals that everything is safe while insurers disagree, the market will trust the actuarial tables. Conversely, they reinforce each other when information flows freely. When incident reporting is transparent, liability rules are clear, and patrol schedules are dependable, insurers can tighten their probability bands. Tighter bands mean more predictable pricing, which means more predictable routing decisions. In that sense, a quiet, reliable patrol can be worth more to trade than a loud promise. Consider moral hazard. If authorities cap downside consequences for certain voyages without aligning behavior, you can get more risky transits than the system can safely absorb. But if rules make liability fall on the parties best able to control risk, the incentives line up. The best safety device at sea is not only a warship on the horizon. It is a contract that makes the people who choose the route internalize the full cost of that choice. There is also the tempo of feedback. Centralized actions often operate in discrete steps. A coalition is announced. A strike is conducted. A new restriction is issued. Decentralized adaptation updates continuously. One incident moves premiums this week, a quiet month nudges them down the next. The faster loop tends to steer behavior because cash flow cares about this week. That does not make centralized action irrelevant. It means its credibility flows into the spreadsheet only when it changes the distribution of outcomes that owners and underwriters believe. So, how do complex systems find resilience? Not by declaring victory at a podium, and not by abandoning coordination to pure luck. Resilience emerges when centralized actors provide reliable information, enforce clear liability, and avoid masking risk with wishful subsidies, while decentralized actors read those signals and select routes, speeds, and inventories that balance safety with efficiency. In that equilibrium, escorts and convoys still matter, but the decisive force is the price that reflects reality closely enough to guide millions of separate decisions toward safer water. On the next slide, we will look forward with a practical dashboard. Which indicators should you watch to tell if the system is healing, drifting, or hardening into a new normal? Let us build a simple dashboard you can keep in your head. Not predictions, but dials. If these dials turn together, you will know whether we are drifting back toward the old normal, settling into a longer D2, or hardening into something structurally different. First dial: attack frequency and severity. Count incidents, but do not stop there. Track how close they come to high traffic corridors, what weapons are used, and whether targets shift from symbols to soft spots. Frequency matters for headlines. Severity moves actuarial tables. A month of quiet lowers perceived risk slowly. One high-severity incident can erase that calm in a day. Second dial: war risk insurance quotes and coverage availability. Do not just ask what the premium is. Ask whether mainstream underwriters are willing to write policies for transits without unusual exclusions. A premium drifting down within a stable band signals confidence. A premium that is jumpy, or coverage that disappears for certain flag states or vessel classes, tells you uncertainty is still in charge. Third dial: canal toll policy and operational reliability. Tolls set the price signal on the official route. If authorities raise fees to recoup lost revenue, they might unintentionally push marginal voyages toward the Cape. If they cut fees or offer incentives tied to security protocols, they can pull traffic back. Watch reliability too. Are convoy timings predictable? Are draft limits and pilotage queue stable? A low toll with unpredictable timing is not cheap once you add missed berths and schedule chaos. Fourth dial: enforcement on the shadow fleet. If regulators tighten inspections, liability, and sanctions on opaque tonnage, some cargoes will move back to mainstream carriers, but at higher visible cost. If enforcement loosens or becomes easy to route around, the shadow fleet expands, carrying more sensitive flows on longer routes. The balance tells you where safety, transparency, and price are settling. Fifth dial: bunker spreads and fuel demand. Look at the relationship between heavy fuel oil, marine gas oil, and crude benchmarks. Rising demand for bunkers along the Cape route, coupled with widening spreads, is the fingerprint of longer voyages. Narrowing spreads and softening demand hint at a partial reversion toward shorter lanes or slower steaming strategies. Sixth dial: schedule reliability and average transit times. Ports, carriers, and analytics firms publish on-time percentages and median voyage lengths by lane. If reliability stabilizes at a lower level while transit times stay elevated, the market has priced in the D2. If reliability improves while times shrink, routes may be swinging back toward Suez. If reliability worsens while times lengthen, we are moving into a more fragile regime. 7th dial. Inventory behavior ashore. Watch importer surveys and warehouse utilization. Rising safety stocks mean firms do not trust schedules. Falling safety stocks mean they do. Inventories tell you how much slack businesses feel they need to buy to sleep at night. Now let us turn those dials into scenarios. A healing scenario looks like this. Incidents drift down in both frequency and severity. Insurers quietly restore capacity and shave premiums. Canal operations become boring in the best sense. Toll policies nudge traffic back without gimmicks. Bunker demand eases, and reliability ticks up. In that world, voyages shorten and prices follow with a lag. A hardening scenario, a new normal, looks like this. Incidents flicker on and off, never catastrophic but never gone. Premiums settle into a higher average with occasional spikes. Tolls do not adjust enough to compensate for perceived risk. Shadow fleet activity remains elevated. Schedules stabilize at longer transit times, and inventories stay thick. In that world, costs remain stickier and the distance tax reappears in 1,000 quiet ways. A drift toward fragility looks like this. A few severe incidents cluster. Coverage tightens abruptly. Escorts and convoy timings become erratic. Cape traffic surges again, bunker spreads widen, and reliability lurches. Inventories climb, air cargo picks up, and tempers fray at port windows. That is when policy decisions and market signals are most likely to collide, and the risk of overreaction rises. The point of a dashboard is not to predict the future. It is to notice the present quickly. If these dials move together, behavior will follow. Shipowners will adjust routes. Insurers will rewrite clauses. Ports will bid for traffic. And you will be able to say not just that something changed, but precisely where the change is coming from and why it matters. We have followed a simple chain from the map to your life. Geography concentrates trade. Rules and tolls turn geography into an effective price. Insurance translates danger into numbers. Captains, owners, and shippers answer those numbers with behavior. And the rest of us feel it in delivery times, shelf variety, and budgets that stretch or snap. So what are the deeper lessons hiding under the headlines? First, concentration is efficient until it is fragile. When billions of dollars flow through a narrow neck, even small shocks become large signals. That does not mean abandon canals or fear big ships. It means respect the hidden cost of tight tolerances and build slack where it matters. Second, prices are not villains. They are warnings. A rising war risk premium is the maritime version of a storm siren. It says, the probability distribution has shifted. When we ignore that siren, we do not beat the market. We just move risk from a spreadsheet into the real world, usually onto people who did not choose it. Third, policy can calm seas or churn them. Clear, credible rules with transparent liability let insurers narrow their uncertainty bands and let owners plan. Confusing signals, or attempts to mask risk with thin reassurances, do the opposite. The most effective centralized actions tend to be the quiet ones that make the price reflect reality more accurately. Fourth, externalities are unpaid invoices. Longer routes and older fleets can raise the chance of accidents and emissions that nobody specifically ordered. If those costs never show up on the voyage ledger, they will appear somewhere else, in a damaged coastline, an overwhelmed rescue service, or a community budget that was not designed for them. Completing the price with accountability is not punishment. It is how we discover safer, smarter patterns without pretending complexity will obey a press release. Fifth, agency matters. This entire story is not only about companies and governments. It is about people who make consequential choices under uncertainty. Masters deciding whether to turn left or right. Underwriters deciding whether to write cover or step back. Port managers deciding whether to adjust fees or invest in reliability. When those choices are aligned with real conditions, systems adapt quickly and often elegantly. Here are the questions I want to leave you with. Are we comfortable letting so much of global prosperity hinge on a handful of choke points? If not, where should we diversify? More ports, different ship sizes, smarter inventory, or better contracts? How do we balance speed against resilience when both are valuable and both are costly? And when we price risk, do we make sure the people who decide the routes carry the consequences of those decisions, so that the incentives point towards safety instead of wishful shortcuts? If you remember nothing else, take this simple lens with you. Risk becomes price. Price becomes behavior. Behavior becomes the world you and I inhabit. If we want a safer, saner world, we do not need to lecture ships. We need to make sure the numbers they see are honest. Thank you for sailing through this with me. If you enjoy thoughtful and entertaining history that digs into the systems behind events, there is more waiting for you. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and check out my book, History They Tried to Erase, in the description. If this episode made you rethink how a narrow strip of water can steer the fate of economies, explore the rest of the channel and keep the conversation going. The past is a map. Let us learn to read it well.